Good evening, everyone. Good to see you again. And special hello to Val, who knows exactly what I'm talking about, being a Strathroy girl and having grown up in a snow belt similar to Shelburne. So, yep, I do complain about the weather quite a bit. And like my daughter likes to say, cry me a river, build a bridge, and get over it. Or her other expression is, would you like a little cheese with your wine? So it doesn't stop me from whining. I consider it therapeutic. Um, but at any rate, let's get back to this consideration of the life of David. We left off last week with his victory over Goliath. And for the last two classes, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about Saul, the kind of man he was, the difficulties Saul ran into very early on in his time as king of Israel, and the contrast he provides us with the kind of character that David had. One thing that I'd like to touch on right at the outset is very often when we think of David, particularly when we think of him at the time when he was introduced to the nation, that he was a bit of a stripling, a boy, young, inexperienced. And in actual fact, it's funny how we like to create certain images which aren't necessarily scriptural. The Bible never says that about David. In fact, the very first description of David in chapter 16 of Samuel is that he is, in the NIV, it says he was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. And some have suggested that expression ruddy in the Hebrew actually means he was red-haired. So he would have struck quite a distinct appearance amongst the undoubtedly darker-haired and possibly darker-hued Semites, the people that he lived amongst. And then later in that chapter, when Saul is being told about David, as I mentioned last week, he's described as a brave man, a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. So in all likelihood, David is at least in his late teens. He was already a man of faith and a man of accomplishment. And it is remarkable that Jesse did not see fit to bring him to the feast so that Samuel could consider him. But apparently Jesse had he had 8 very capable, fine-looking sons. He was a well-blessed man. In fact, of his sons, we come to find out in chapter 17 that only the 3 oldest joined Saul in battle. They came forward to serve in Saul's army. So I guess Jesse felt, hey, I got 8 sons. I'll bring 7 of them, leave the youngest tending the sheep. So that might have been all that it was. I did suggest that based on Psalm 51, where David talks about being conceived in iniquity, some have suggested that David was possibly the son of a concubine, or a situation that had arisen in Jesse's life that was not particularly honorable. Maybe not. Nonetheless, he is not brought forward by Jesse, and it is God who has to say, look, I need this 8th son. He's the one I want, and he's the one whom God chose. And then, of course, in chapter 17, we have that remarkable story of David's victory over Goliath in the face of everyone else's fear. The nation was gripped with a sense of foreboding that this challenge that Goliath had brought was a little bit unique. They were used to pitch battles, not to some 9-foot heavily armed man coming forward and challenging one individual to combat. And of course, the Philistines knew it was a no-brainer. Who was going to beat this guy? Of course, they weren't counting on a man full of faith, and that's exactly the kind of man David was. And And then, of course, at the end of chapter 17, David does a remarkable thing, and he cuts off Goliath's head, and he takes it to Jerusalem. And I don't recall whether I discussed this last time or not. I may have mentioned it, but there seems to be in David's mind a sense of destiny already. He wants that city. He knows the importance of that city. This is the city where Mount Moriah is located, where Abraham offered Isaac. It is a city that the location is full of prophetic import. It was this city that Melchizedek ruled over, the one who blessed Abraham. And as Paul points out in Hebrews, the lesser is blessed of the greater. And David was a man of God. You see, Saul, when he was filled with the Spirit of God and prophesied amongst the prophets, the reaction of everyone around him was, well, Saul amongst the prophets? It became a proverb in Israel. This man was not reputed to be well versed in the Word of God. David, on the other hand, was. He had already composed psalms. He was already a man moved by the Spirit of God, not only to utter forth psalms and hymns, but also it enabled him to protect his flock from a lion and a bear. So, David, this was not foreign to David. This wasn't like Saul, who got thrust into the national limelight and immediately revealed hesitation. He hid amongst the baggage. He vacillated. There was elements of uncertainty in Saul's character. Not so with this man, David. He was a man who understood that God had a plan and purpose. And now David recognized that he was going to play an integral part in it. And it's like he merged into that almost effortlessly. And it wasn't because David was self-absorbed or proud or arrogant. It was because David believed these things. And so when God called upon him to rule the nation, David accepted it with graciousness, with restraint, with respect. And one thing that was going to become evident, as we well know, is that it was going to take a long time for David to finally take the throne. And he patiently waited for God to work out his will. And it speaks so much to the depth of the man. And it was a depth that was there already. God knew who he was picking. He knew who he was picking the first time. He did. He knew his man Saul. And God gave Saul every opportunity. In a way, when we reflect on God's choice of Saul, it does speak to this issue. And that is, we often will question God. God, why don't you give that man a chance? Why don't you give this man a chance? Why don't you help this guy the way you help that guy? You're not fair, God. And we very often get caught up in these, second guessing divine action and divine decisions and the divine way. And Saul and David provide us with an excellent example of God saying, all right, Israel, I'm going to pick a king for you, and I'm going to pick every man's man. All right? Not going to pick anybody particularly special, or I'm not even going to pick somebody who I would be inclined to pick. I'm going to pick somebody you'd be inclined to pick. And not only that, I'm going to give him every advantage I possibly can. I'm going to fill him with my spirit. I'm going to empower him. I'm going to encourage him. I'm going to surround him with wise counsel and good advice. I'm going to give this pick every advantage I can, short of taking over his will. And God did that with Saul. The problem was Saul, instead of being true to God, was true to himself. The thing that everyone, thought of, Saul prophesying, that's odd. Well, yeah, it was odd for a reason. because Saul was not a man of God. He was not a man after God's own heart. He wasn't that interested. So, in a way, it brings into focus the fact that, when God makes decisions about the destiny of humanity, when God intervenes and interacts in certain ways, we would be far better off respecting God's way and God's decisions in the affairs of men, and not perpetually second guessing the choices the Almighty makes. Because God will on occasion, do something like he did with Saul. And, hey, I'm going to help this man. And what did that man do? He saw it as an opportunity to glorify himself and not God. Another example would be Judas Iscariot. What individual could have had more advantages than the man Judas Iscariot? And look what he did with it in the end. So there was an expression my dad told me years ago, and it was in response to a university course he was taking. And this university course was, of course, filled with the critical thinking, and it was very disparaging of the Bible, very disparaging of inspiration and in Christianity. It was, of course, on the Bible as literature. And initially, it was very disturbing to my dad's faith, because the things that they were saying about the Bible were extremely critical and put the Bible in a very poor light from an inspirational point of view. And after my dad went through this course and looked into the different things they were saying, he realized that their accusations about the Bible were quite baseless. The Bible did not contradict itself. The Bible didn't have two or three or four different storylines. God's character was consistent throughout the length and breadth of the scripture. And he came up with an expression, and it was this: God beyond reproof, man without excuse. And the man Saul speaks to that very issue. In God's dealings with Saul, God was beyond reproof, and Saul was without excuse. He could have made different choices. And that's why he stands in such marked contrast to the man David. So David takes the head of Goliath, he takes it to the city of Jerusalem, he puts it on open display, and it was clearly a challenge to the Jebusites that, in effect, they're next. That their hold on this holy place was going to be terminated at some point in the not too distant future. And of course, we know David did see to that. So David is now catapulted to the forefront of the nation. He is now touted as a national hero. And I mentioned a class ago how what a great character Jonathan had proved to be and was going to continue to be in the life of David. And this is very evident in the first few verses of chapter 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him, and did not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, if Jonathan knew David was destined to be king, we can only assume that many knew as well. Many others knew as well. How Saul couldn't know, I don't know. For some reason, he chooses to set whatever information he had aside and reveled in the success of this young man. Saul was, at this point in time, delighted to have David alongside of him. Jonathan definitely knew David was to be king, and he acknowledges that by giving David the tokens of his royal position. That it was a remarkable thing to do, and Jonathan fell in love with this man. He fell in love with David because he recognized in David a kindred spirit, a man of faith, a man who loved the things of God. Jonathan was just such a man, just such a remarkable character. And you know, we often think to ourselves, you know, what is a young person to do if they come from a difficult background or a disadvantaged background, or come from a family where the things of God are not respected? Well, that's exactly the kind of family Jonathan came from. Jonathan grew up in a household where the things of God were fundamentally disrespected. His father did it over and over again. Jonathan could see through it. He could recognize his father for who he was and chose to be a different man. That's powerful. And that speaks to everyone's fundamental responsibility to serve the Lord their God with all their soul and all their might and all their heart and all their power. That's a choice each one of us needs to make, regardless of what our life experience has been. Jonathan's life experience had not been very encouraging, and it was going to continue to be quite discouraging, because his father was going to sink deeper and deeper into this morose, evil spirit characterized by hatred, jealousy, envy, and murderous rage. Just on and on and on. And Jonathan was able to stay the course. What a fantastic character he is. So we find David is put in a position of responsibility, and hopefully everyone's reading ahead and familiarizing yourselves a little bit with this, with the content of David's life. You know, just because we don't have time to read it all, but what we find in this chapter 18 is David very quickly commends himself to everyone around him. David is a lovely character. He works well with those around him. It talks about, well, in verse 16, but all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. He was a leader who looked after those around him and not himself. But as we well know, you know, as popular opinion would have it, in verse 6, when men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing and joyful songs and tambourines. And as they danced, oh boy, the fateful song. Ooh, but David heard the words of this song and was like, oh, new lyrics, new lyrics, new lyrics. Not this one again. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Ouch. That just devastated Saul. And it took a depressed, angry man and made him homicidal. He was furious at this loss of face. Absolutely determined to eliminate this individual who one moment Saul was himself happy to put on a pedestal, and the next moment was doing his utmost to kill him. Now, what is a little bit remarkable about this situation is the number of times David puts himself in harm's way. Because we know, verse 10, David is playing the harp, he's trying to help Saul calm down, and Saul develops this rather nasty habit of hurling a spear at David. And David alludes in this instance twice. And then later on, in chapter 19, Jonathan is determined to make this relationship work, and he is desperate to create a positive relationship between David and his father. He speaks well of David, verse 4 of chapter 19, to Saul his father. Let not the king do wrong to his servant. He has not wronged you. He has only benefited you, took his life in his hands. So David, comes back. Saul assures him, verse 6, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So poor David once again goes and plays the harp for Saul, And in verse 10 of 19, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. And at this point, David has to escape fully. But, you have to ask yourself about David. I must say, if somebody threw a spear at me once, I'd be done. That would not, I don't think I give that individual a second opportunity to do that to me again. And it happens to David 3 times. And then that's followed up by Saul basically, he would have knifed David in his sickbed if he could have. The number of chances David gives Saul to put this right is quite remarkable. And we know that in short order, David is going to become a fugitive. He's going to become the most wanted man in Israel. He is going to be hunted for years by Saul, and not just by Saul, but Saul brings the entire might of his army to bear on this situation. I mean, what a miscarriage of justice when you think about it. Here is Saul, who needs to be fighting the enemies of Israel, and he's taking whatever military might Israel had, and Israel was not a militarized nation by any means. It was certainly what wasn't feared in the area for its. It wasn't until really David came along that Israel started to develop some creds in the battlefield. Until then, they were probably the laughing stock of the area. But at any rate, whatever army Saul had at his disposal, he's using to hunt down the most righteous man in the nation. And David bears with this situation for years. I don't know about you, but I would not be able to summon that level of tolerance and patience and just endurance. That was incredible. And the fact that David put himself in harm's way, he knew the man. He knew Saul was in trouble. And I think what that speaks to is David's profound faith in his heavenly Father. David knew he had been anointed king. And he knew God wasn't doing that it wasn't a frivolous choice. It wasn't a passing fancy on God's part. David knew that this was God's express intent, and he fully expected to eventually be king over the nation. And because of that assurance, that David had a deep-seated conviction about these things, that he was prepared to bear with these circumstances and let God work it out in his own good time. And that's a huge challenge, friends, for any godly individual, letting God work out things in his own time. We're exceptionally impatient creatures. We always have been. From the time of Adam and Eve in the garden, we've always wanted it now. That was Saul's problem. He wanted everything now. When he got a taste of the power and glory of what it meant to be king, he wanted it all immediately, and wanted to accrue to himself all the accoutrements of kingliness, even when it meant disobeying the express command of God. David was different to that. He exhibited just an amazing amount of patience and forbearance. And that was to be evident in David's life over and over again, his willingness to let God work out his plan in his own good time. So we find David in short order is on the run. And of course, there's that, you talk about an interesting situation. David was going to, he had been promised to be the king's son-in-law. Whoever slew Goliath would be married to the king's daughter. And Saul reneged on that promise. He gave Merab, his older daughter, to another man. But as it turned out, Saul's daughter, Michal, was madly in love with David. And Saul found out about it and decided, you know what? I have a way of getting rid of this guy. I'm going to let the Philistines do it. So he, so the end of verse 25 of Samuel, 1 Samuel 18, Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. So the whole issue of the 100 foreskins. And of course, David brings him 200 foreskins. Now, it's a, if we were analyzing literature, we would call this situation an example of foreshadowing. Because in David's darkest moments, he employs the same tactic as Saul to rid himself of an inconvenient individual in his life. And that was Uriah the Hittite. Saul was conspiring to have David slain by their enemies. It didn't work. Years later, David resorts to the same device. In his case, it did work, and Uriah was killed. Interesting, isn't it? That when David succumbs to his darkest instincts, he ends up for a brief period in his life behaving like this man Saul. Never a good idea to imitate the tactics of a bad person. In fact, very often, we ask ourselves in any given situation, what's the right thing to do? What's the wrong thing to do? Well, one guideline we can always adopt is, what did a good man do in this situation? What were his choices? How did he respond? How did he react? And let that be a template. And if what we're wanting to do, or what we decide to do, or what we're contemplating to do is similar to what an evil man did, it might be a good indication it's not a good idea. And it's too bad that when David fell into that situation, he didn't remember what Saul had attempted to do to him. Maybe David did, and maybe that's why David did it. He thought, well, it was an idea, and he was desperate. But an interesting connection. So we find that David is running afoul of Saul, and it finally gets to a point where David is quite convinced that if he gets anywhere near Saul, he is going to slay him. So in chapter 20, David and Jonathan concoct this scheme whereby Saul's intent might be fully known. And this may have been one of David and Jonathan's concerns. And that is, were Saul's attempts on David's life premeditated, or were they simply the expression of a loss of temper? Were they, like killing a man in a fit of rage, which is manslaughter as opposed to a premeditated murder? And I guess you can forgive a man if he loses his cool and does something rash or inappropriate. If he's actually plotting to do it, that's a little different story. And David was now becoming convinced that Saul was plotting to have him killed. And Jonathan wanted to hold on to this idea that this relationship was redeemable. And you can understand how desperate Jonathan would have been to hold on to it. He knew that his obligation lay with his father. He could not leave. In fact, Jonathan would not leave. And he remained with his father to the point of death, because he and his brothers and Saul were all slain on the mountains of Gilboa when they are overrun by the Philistines. That was Jonathan's level of loyalty. So he knew he couldn't walk away from his father. So he wanted to do everything he could to keep David in the family, in the court, close to him. And in chapter 20, David's conclusion is, "Yet as surely as the Lord lives," verse 3, "and as you live, there is only a step between me and death." And he even begins to question, to a certain extent, Jonathan's objectivity. But they come up with this plan, and the plan is to tell Saul that David is down, is in Bethlehem, honoring a sacrifice with his family, and but David was going to hide in the field, and he was going to, wait there until Jonathan was able to clearly understand the thoughts and intents of his father. It gives us a little opportunity to consider something which has always been a pet peeve of mine. And when I was growing up, there was this constant angst over whether David lied and whether Jonathan lied to Saul in order to further this plan of theirs. Because the whole idea was to make up this excuse why David wasn't present at the Feast of the New Moon, and then to be able to determine where Saul's head was at. And I can remember sitting in Bible classes, and there was just, endless discussion about whether David lied or not. And I was, later I came to realize there isn't a single thing said in the Bible about whether David lied or not. It was immaterial at this point in time. And, some suggested, well, actually David could have been in Bethlehem, and then it was very close. He could have easily gotten into the field before, in time for Jonathan to come out and shoot the arrows and tell David exactly where things lie. So it always, I think it's a little concerning when we read about the lives of these individuals and almost become a bit obsessive about whether they did something right or wrong, and almost seem to want to, pass some sort of judgment, because the arguments I've heard is that, well, David lied. Well, that was a dereliction of faith. He wasn't trusting in God. He wasn't doing the right thing. Kind of almost condemning him when actually the scriptural testimony is quite the opposite. And I always found that to be a quite a waste of time. So I'm not going to talk about it anymore, other than to make those comments that I just did. At any rate, David and Jonathan are able to discern the mind of Saul, and David has to leave. They know he has to leave, and they swear an oath to each other. At the end of 20, Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. Now, the interesting thing is that when Jonathan swore an oath in the name of the Lord, he meant it. Saul did it over and over again, and it was meaningless. It was quite meaningless. So and these weren't light oaths, to swear in the name of the Lord. That was a powerful statement. That was, something that God himself took note of. He who swears to his own hurt and changes not. But Saul treated these things with disregard. They weren't important to him. They were words. There was nothing in the man's heart that was really redeemable. And I commented in the earlier classes that Saul did prove to be a valiant warrior. He did prove to be capable of ruling the nation at least some level. And when David commemorates the death of Saul and Jonathan, David sees fit to praise Saul. Praise him for the effective leadership he had provided, and for battling Israel's enemies as effectively as he did. David was able to find those words, and he didn't make them up. It was true. Saul, could be a valiant man. He could be a brave man, but he was a deeply flawed man who was overwhelmed by a deep-seated lack of trust in God. And the other thing, and I think I've made note of this before, it's not that Saul didn't believe in God. All right? Saul knew God. He knew the promises. He knew the truth, knew his Bible, in the sense that he knew, what was going on. He might not have had a deep and intimate connection with it, but he knew. He wasn't an ignorant man. Okay? Faith is not about knowing. Faith is something else. It's about a conviction. It's a belief that moves us to make changes and do things in our life. That's what faith is. Many, many men and women believe in God. Many men and women are convinced that the Bible has accurate prophecies that will in all likelihood come true. That's not an uncommon belief in people's lives. The problem is it doesn't necessarily move them to make changes. It doesn't create in them a willing-hearted spirit to do the will of God. That's the difference between a Saul and a David. David's understanding, his comprehension, his knowledge, his understanding, in his heart did something to him. It put him in a different place. And that's our challenge as Bible readers and Bible believers, that we react like a David. We make practical changes in our lives. Makes a difference. Oh, I can read the book and yeah, great. I believe it. Believe that there's a God. I believe his son came, rose from the dead. Yep, no problem. But does it make a difference to me? Is it inspiring change? And that's what that was the difference between a Saul and a David, and that's what it did to Jonathan. Jonathan and David, they bonded because they were doing the same thing. They had a connection at a deep and profound and spiritual level. It was fantastic. So David's on the run, and he the first thing that he goes to Samuel, and but he can't stay there. Actually, where he goes, yeah, actually, okay, he goes, sorry, backtrack a little bit. Back in 19, when David's fleeing from Saul, and when he did that I'm sick thing, he actually goes to Samuel. And he and Samuel flee, and the Spirit of God comes on Saul, and he prophesies once again. And that saves David and Samuel from Saul's wrath. But this time, David flees, and he comes to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And we talked a little bit about whether David deceived or didn't deceive in chapter 20. Actually, David was doing his best to outfox Saul in chapter 19, in chapter 20, and once again in chapter 21. Because when he's confronted by Ahimelech, he basically tells a lie and says, "The king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, no one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions." And he asked for bread, and then he actually asked for a weapon. And we won't get into all the details of David taking the showbread, and Jesus uses it as an example of principle over law, which is exactly how the Lord uses this. But what is evident is that David is escaping from an extremely difficult antagonist. And the reason it's difficult is because Saul has enormous resources at his disposal. And Saul is becoming increasingly known for his uncontrolled temper. And what is going to happen because of this encounter between David and Ahimelech is that Saul is going to slaughter all the priests of Nob. In fact, he's going to put to death the entire town of Nob, men, women, and children and infants. And it's cattle, donkeys, and sheep, which is interesting because Saul didn't want to do that with the Amalekites, but for some reason he subjects the city of Nob to it. And again, we can ask ourselves, well, come on, David, what are you doing here? And again, these are not situations that are necessarily criticized by Scripture. These things play out, and David effects his escape, and he takes the sword of Goliath and moves on. And he later comments on Doeg the Edomite's presence in Nob. It says in verse 7, now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg the Edomite, Saul's head shepherd. And we know that later on, he is the only servant of Saul willing to put the priest to death. The rest of Saul's men refused to do it. And not only is Saul homicidal, he's now practically genocidal in that he's prepared to slaughter all these people to vent his anger, frustration, and rage. He just finds one lower depth after another to sink to. David knew that this whole situation could be problematic. David leaves Nob and he flees to Gath. That was a remarkable choice on David's part. But it's not remarkable if you consider how desperately David needed to remove himself from Saul's reach. And he finds himself in Gath, city of the city of Goliath. And immediately the Philistines, hey, this is David. What's he doing here? And they repeat the popular song of the day. And David gets afraid and feigns himself a madman in order to elude any repercussions from the Philistines. And then he ends up at the beginning of 22 in the cave of Adullam, where he begins to attract a group of discontented individuals. Now, putting all this together, all right, I've been going on a bit about David's faith, David's conviction, David's commitment, his spirituality, man after God's own heart. And when you read through this section, it would be easy to second guess all that and say, David, you're not looking too good right now. You seem to be making decisions and doing things not from a place of faith, but from a place of impetuousness, panic, and fear. And what I would respond, or how I would respond to that concern, is that when we work out our lives, when we negotiate difficult situations, very often in the course of doing that, we will make decisions and we will do things that provide a short-term relief from whatever intense pressure we're being subjected to at the moment. Now, I'm not so glib as to come up with examples of how that might look or work out for us. I think we can all maybe reflect on situations that happened where we, may have said things and done things that we weren't particularly proud of, but nonetheless, that's what we did at that moment in time in order to, move past a difficulty. It speaks to our humanity, to the fact that, we all share things in common, and, being fearful, being worried, being concerned, is common to the human condition. It doesn't necessarily mean that at that point in time we've lost all hope or faith or trust. Okay? So David is on the run. He's a fugitive now. He says and does things that might not be putting him in a particularly good light. But through it all, David hasn't lost his connection to God. And God does not comment on these choices David makes. They just play out. And David, it becomes apparent to David very quickly that there is no way he can remain in any kind of, mainstream community, either in Israel, in Judah. He can't even do it with the Philistines. He is genuinely going to have to go out on his own. And I don't think that was necessarily something David thought was going to happen to him. for such a long period of time. David was going to be excluded from the main flow of Israelitish life for many years. Now think about it. You know, if you were a godly man and things were happening to you, which were very bad, would you necessarily conclude that God was going to put you in a position that would remove you from fellowship and interchange with the main congregation? But that's what happened to David. In fact, one of the Psalms he writes talks about being excluded from the Lord in the sense that he could not participate in formal worship. He couldn't offer sacrifices. He couldn't attend to any ritual cleansing. He couldn't talk to, the teachers, the priests, the prophets. God sent him. Eventually, God sent him a priest, the one that survived, Abiathar. God would send him occasional prophetic messages. There were means by which God communicated with David, but I don't think David anticipated this, such a complete separation. He had to live in isolation for years. It was very similar to what happened to Moses when he attempted to rescue Israel from Egypt. Would Moses have ever dreamt that he was destined for 40 years of isolation in the wilderness of Sinai? And that's exactly where God wanted him. That's apparently where God wanted David for a period of time. You're going to have to step aside. You can't be part of this right now. And that would have been an incredibly sobering reflection, for David. Now, the good thing was he was well prepared for that because he had spent years, his early years, tending sheep in the wilderness and being on his own and developing a connection with God, quite independent of anyone else around him. So, it's interesting how David's early years prepared him for something that, once you get brought into the main stage, you're a national hero, you're a captain in the king's army. In fact, you're the king's son-in-law. Would you ever dream all of that would be taken away from you? No, of course you wouldn't. But it was taken away from David. And he resorted to this cave of Adullam. And what did he have around him? David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. So, it wasn't that David was alone in that sense, but he would have felt alone in regards to what he had before. It was a completely different situation. And, when we look at our lives and when we consider, different things that have happened to us, which, and I think we can all speak to the fact that life challenges us with turns we never saw coming, trials that we, really didn't imagine, or if we did, we really didn't expect them to happen, but they did, and we had to we had to deal with it. Those things come our way, and they create a situation where either we're able to draw on resources we've built up for ourselves in the good years, or we become, discouraged, bitter, and isolated, and not isolated from, our brothers and sisters, but really isolated from our faith, our conviction, our commitments, and we're destroyed. We become overwhelmed and destroyed. And that could have happened to David, and it didn't. He held on. He had resources inside of him that enabled him to work through this period, and it went on for years, and until finally, Saul and his sons are killed, and the nation turns to David. But even after that, there was 8 years of civil war between the household of David and the household of Saul. Didn't happen right away. But David is now, dealing with a very different set of circumstances than he ever would have thought possible for him. And kind of the sad thing is that his wife chooses not to join him. Michal is, boy, she's her father's daughter. She's her father's daughter. That girl had some weaknesses. And they finally come to fruition when David brings the ark into Jerusalem years later, and she despises him. Very, very sad. And she helps him escape. She, tells the lie about him being sick and gets him out the back window, but seemed to be the extent of her willingness to support her husband. So David's on the run. He's a fugitive. And David finds himself hiding in the wilderness of Judea, and he takes in Abiathar, the one escapee from Saul's slaughter of the priests, and he begins this life on the run. And, here's David, a national hero. He was defeating the Philistines. In chapter 23, he saves the men of Keilah who are being looted by the Philistines. And, Dave, kind of a fascinating little story. He helps this little community from the Philistines in the first few verses of chapter 23. And, then David, poor David, he kind of shows his hand by doing it. I mean, he could have just kept quiet and remained hidden, but he chose not to, and God blesses his intent and his effort. But Saul finds out David's down in Keilah, and the first of many, many distressing situations. In verse 11, he asks, he says to Abiathar, "Bring me the ephod. Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will." Again, David asked, "Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul?" The Lord said, "They will." And David's on the run again. Just save their lives, save their possessions. They're going to turn on him. But, David must have understood how challenging it was. I mean, he just saw Saul wipe out the priests of God in a fit of anger and homicidal rage. He would have done the same to these men of Keilah. They were, whoa, you want David, you take him, better him than us. And that was the kind of challenge David was dealing with. And in a few years, these very people who were prepared to turn David in are now going to ask him to be their king. And David does so with a complete spirit of graciousness and forgiveness and forbearance. David doesn't come after these individuals after the fact and make them pay for what they did. Not at all. He is completely forgiving of all these betrayals and the lack of appreciation, the lack of gratitude, he just moves from one place to the next. It's interesting, you talk about men of faith and how they behave. Samson, who often gets criticized for all his dalliances with women, this was how Samson behaved. When Samson, when the men of Judah came to Samson and said, "Look, you're upsetting the Philistines, we've got to turn you in." He goes, "Okay, bind me up, turn me in." And of course, he was able to, break the bonds and slaughter the Philistines. He doesn't go after these men of Judah. He doesn't, heap recriminations on them. He sees them for what they were. They were just a bunch of scared individuals who didn't know which way to turn. They were, between a rock and a hard place, as it were. These men of God were able to find mercy and grace and compassion and forgiveness, even when confronted with immense disappointment. And that was certainly David's lot in life. Over and over again, he was confronted with a lot of disappointing behavior. And one, probably one of the most remarkable, scriptures that I can think of when I contemplate the life of David is when David is, and we'll get into this, next week. But David ends up living in the land of the Philistines. He occupies the town of Ziklag for a year. And the town is attacked by Amalekites. Everyone's possessions are burned. Their families are taken. Fortunately, no one was killed. And in 1 Samuel 30, just to jump ahead a little bit, in verse 6, David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. And, to me, that speaks to how did this man keep on keeping on? Because he was able to find strength in God, and he did it at a time when he was very much alone. And that was David's way. He was able to, in the absence of any human help, any human solace, any human encouragement, he was able to find strength in God. And there's a verse in Psalms, put not your trust in princes or the Son of Man in whom is no help. We can develop these expectations and reliances upon, people and other, individuals, whether it's spouses or children or siblings or brothers and sisters or, whoever. And boy, sometimes we really get let down, and it can be quite devastating. And you look at a man like David, and when that happened to him, his faith wasn't destroyed. He was able to find strength in God. And that is a trait, friends, that is absolutely imperative for every servant of God to develop. You've got to be able to fall back on God and him alone when everyone else has deserted you. And those times will happen. They just happen. And they either make you or destroy you. And we can be made if we put our trust in the Lord. So I guess that's it. We better wrap it up. Oh, 2 minutes over. Ray, can Mary make a comment?
Oh, sure, we'll allow that.
All right, Lovey.
I was just going to say there's a nice progression between Jonathan coming out and says Jonathan strengthened his hand in God twice.
Yeah.
We can't hear her very well.
Yeah.
He said it says
David
strengthened himself.
Yeah. No, what Mary said is the times that Jonathan came to David when he was on the run, and it expressly says that Jonathan strengthened David's hand in the Lord. And I was going to touch on that, but it certainly speaks to what a wonderful character Jonathan was. But the fact that David was able to draw on those times. Jonathan was gone. Jonathan was out of the picture now, and he wasn't coming back. And so David was able to strengthen himself in the Lord. So Any other questions? Any comments?
I appreciate you talking about Samson too. We are literally right in the middle of the story of Samson on Tuesday nights. So
okay.
Help shed a little bit of light on that and help to bolster Dana's argument as opposed to mine. So thank you.
No problem. All right. Do you want me to close then?
Anything else for David tonight? Any other questions? Okay. Yeah, you go ahead and close, David.
All right. Father, we thank you for this opportunity, the freedom we enjoy to do this, and certainly richly blessed by your word, Father. It contains so many different things. It instructs us and encourages us and helps us and helps us to draw closer to you and your Son. So help the example of David and Jonathan and other godly men to go with us, and godly women as well to go with us through the week and our days. We long for your Son's return. We pray for your blessing as we part, and we offer this in his name, in Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, thanks very much for your kind attention, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you again. We will email you some brownies or something for dessert.
Oh, sounds good. Okay.
All right. Good night to you both.
Night.
Yeah, stay warm.
We're working on it. We're working on it.